In the frozen heart of the Altai Mountains, where the wind scours the steppe and time itself seems to hold its breath, archaeologists brushed away the last layers of permafrost from a Scythian tomb. Before we start, a quick roll call. Write in the comments which part of this planet you're watching from, and then just listen and enjoy. Inside this burial mound, a man-made hill known as a kurgan, lay a chieftain, undisturbed for over 2.5 millennia. His skin, preserved by the ice, was a canvas of intricate tattoos depicting mythical beasts. He was dressed in sable and ermine, a golden torque at his throat, and an arsenal of exquisitely crafted weapons at his side. But he was not alone. Lying next to him, positioned as if in a peaceful sleep, was a young woman. She was adorned in her finest silk tunic and an elaborate headdress of gilded wood, a silent, beautiful companion for eternity. Her presence was not an accident, nor a tragedy of shared fate. She was a sacrifice, her life intentionally ended to accompany her master into the next world. This quiet tableau, a frozen moment of profound devotion and unspeakable violence, raises a question that echoes from countless burial sites across the ancient world. Why did so many cultures separated by vast oceans and thousands of years believe that a woman's life must end with her husband's? By the end of our journey together, we will have explored the complex web of power, belief, and personhood that underpins this unsettling tradition, uncovering not just the darkness, but also the enduring human search for meaning in the face of oblivion. The tomb in the Altai is more than a grave. It is a time capsule of a belief system, a worldview sealed in ice. The Scythians, a nomadic people who thundered across the Eurasian steppe from the 9th to the 2nd century BCE, saw the afterlife not as a wispy, ethereal realm, but as a direct continuation of earthly existence. For a chieftain, death was not an ending but a relocation. To arrive in this other world without his status, his comforts, and his retinue was unthinkable. It would be an arrival in poverty and powerlessness. And so, his world had to be packed up and sent with him. Archaeologists excavating these kurgans find a microcosm of a nomad's life. They find disassembled wagons, intricate carpets from Persia, and vessels filled with the residue of fermented mare's milk. They find the chieftain's most prized horses, sometimes a dozen or more, slaughtered and arranged with their bridles and saddles intact, ready to gallop across the celestial plains. This was a funeral of staggering expense and logistical complexity, a testament to the power the man wielded in life. But the most profound and disturbing element of this traveling court was its human component. Let's return to the woman beside him. Her official title is lost to us, but she was likely a wife, a favored concubine, or a primary attendant. Her bones tell a story that her silent lips cannot. Forensic analysis of similar burials often reveals that the companion was not buried alive in the suffocating darkness. That mercy, if we can call it that, was usually granted. Instead, she was likely given a potent drink, a mixture of narcotics to lull her into a stupor before a swift, sharp blow to the head ended her life. The goal was not to inflict terror, but to ensure a seamless transition. Her role was to continue her service, to provide the comfort and companionship her lord was accustomed to, ensuring his status remained undiminished in the land of the dead. She lies there, a picture of tranquility, her head resting on a wooden pillow, her embroidered stockings still vibrant. The care taken in her dress and adornment is almost tender, a stark and chilling contrast to the fundamental violence of the act itself. She was dressed for a journey, not for a grave. This single frozen scene from the Scythian plains is not an isolated oddity of a barbaric culture. It is instead one of the clearest illustrations of a practice that has surfaced with haunting consistency across the globe. We see echoes of it in the grand burial pits of ancient Chinese emperors, filled with the skeletons of hundreds of concubines and servants. We find it in the rites of the Natchez people of North America, where the death of a great chief called a son triggered a wave of ritual sacrifices among his wives and retainers. We can trace its logic in the early dynasties of Egypt and in certain chiefdoms of sub-Saharan Africa. These cultures had no contact with one another. They developed their traditions in complete isolation. And yet, they independently arrived at the same grim conclusion that a person of great importance cannot and should not travel into death alone. The silence in that Scythian tomb is the same silence found in burial sites the world over. A silence heavy with the unspoken stories of those whose identities were so completely tied to another that their own life had no perceived value after his was extinguished. Think of the community that performed this ritual. For them, this was not murder. It was a sacred duty, a necessary act to maintain cosmic order and honor their leader. The woman herself may have been conditioned from birth to see this as her ultimate purpose, a moment of supreme honor that would elevate her status in the afterlife and secure her family's prestige among the living. The line between coercion and consent becomes impossibly blurred by the weight of absolute belief. The entire ceremony was a piece of public theater, reinforcing the social structure. It sent a clear message to everyone. The leader's power is so immense that it transcends the very boundary of death. It can command the loyalty and the very life force of those around him, binding them to his fate for eternity. But as we stand at the edge of this icy grave, looking down at the two figures locked together in a deathly embrace, we are compelled to look past the cultural logic and see the human reality. We see one person whose life was considered a complete story, and another whose life was seen as a mere chapter in his. And in that unsettling stillness, we begin a journey to understand how such a profound inequality could be carved into the most sacred rituals of a people. To understand the silent woman in the Scythian tomb, we need to give her story a name. Anthropologists and historians refer to this practice with a range of terms, from the specific widow sacrifice to the broader retainer sacrifice. At its core, it is the ritual killing of a person or people to accompany a deceased individual into the afterlife. The method varied as much as the cultures that practiced it. In some societies, like the ones we will later explore in India, it took the form of immolation, where a widow would join her husband on his funeral pyre. In others, as with the Scythians, it was a more direct act of killing, often by strangulation, poison, or a blow to the head, followed by a careful burial alongside the primary deceased. And perhaps most chillingly, there are accounts from cultures like ancient China and parts of Africa where companions were buried alive, sealed in a tomb to slowly succumb to asphyxiation in the dark, their terror meant to serve as a final, absolute testament to their master's power. These variations, while gruesome to contemplate, all spring from the very same root, a belief that human relationships, hierarchies, and obligations do not simply dissolve at the moment of death. Instead, they are considered so fundamental that they must be packed up and carried into eternity. Now, it's important for us to make a careful distinction. The long history of humanity is filled with many forms of ritual killing, and it is easy to lump them all together. For millennia, people were sacrificed to appease what were perceived as angry gods, to ensure a bountiful harvest, or to guarantee the stability of a newly constructed temple or bridge, a grim practice known as foundation. Sacrifice. In those instances, the life taken was an offering, a transaction with a powerful non-human entity. The victim was a gift to a deity or a spirit. But what we are discussing here is profoundly different. The recipient of this ultimate gift was not a god in the sky, but the man in the grave. The purpose was not appeasement, but companionship. It was not about influencing the cosmos, but about recreating a microcosm of the deceased's earthly world in another realm. Think of it less as a religious offering and more as a matter of spiritual logistics. The dead, especially the powerful dead, were believed to have needs. They would need their advisors, their guards, their musicians, their cooks, their servants, and of course their wives and concubines. This practice, then, is the ultimate expression of the idea that you can, in fact, take it with you. This entire framework rests upon a single, powerful, cosmological belief that the afterlife is a direct mirror of earthly existence. It is not a place of abstract spiritual reward or punishment based on one's moral character. It is quite simply a continuation. A king who dies is expected to continue ruling in the next world. A great warrior is expected to continue fighting. A wealthy patriarch is expected to maintain his household. To arrive in this next world alone would be to arrive as a refugee, stripped of the status and identity that defined you in life. A king without his court is not a king, he is just a man. A chieftain without his warriors is not a leader, he is a solitary wanderer. His power and prestige in the afterlife were seen as directly proportional to the retinue he brought with him. The sacrifice of his companions was therefore not just for his comfort, but for the very preservation of his identity. His wife's eternal role was to continue being his wife, to manage his household in the spirit world. His guard's duty was to keep watch over his eternal tomb. Their individual lives were seen as threads so tightly woven into the tapestry of his that they could not be cut away without unraveling his entire existence, both here and hereafter. And so the term widow sacrifice is often too narrow. While a wife or consort was frequently the principal companion, the entourage could be vast. The royal tombs of the Shang Dynasty in China contain the remains of entire military units, complete with their chariots and horses, buried in formation around their general. In ancient Egypt, the earliest pharaohs were interred with servants, artisans, and officials. When a Natchez chief died in the Mississippi Valley, not only his wives but also his friends and aides would volunteer to join him in a highly ritualized communal ceremony of death. In each case, the logic is the same. A person's social role was not a job they held from 9 to 5. It was their entire being, and this being did not cease to exist at death. For a servant to die with her master was not seen as an end to her life, but as an uninterrupted continuation of her duty, the only life she had ever known. This concept is alien to our modern sensibilities, which are built upon foundations of individualism and autonomy. But for these ancient societies, the group was everything, and the individual was a component part of that larger social body. Death, then, was not an escape from your role. For many, it was the moment that role became permanent, sealed for all time in the cold, quiet earth. To truly grasp the scale and meaning of this practice, we must return to the Scythian kurgans, those silent grassy mounds that dot the Eurasian steppe from the Danube to the borders of China. These are not simple graves. They are monumental statements of power, engineered to last for eternity and to project the status of their occupant across both the physical and metaphysical landscapes. The Scythians were a formidable people, master horsemen and archers who lived a life in the saddle. Theirs was a fiercely hierarchical society, built around warrior chieftains who amassed enormous wealth through trade, tribute, and warfare. Their art, a dazzling array of goldwork depicting predator animals in dynamic, swirling combat, speaks of a culture obsessed with strength, ferocity, and the untamed power of the natural world. It is this worldview, this celebration of dominant power, that finds its ultimate expression in their burial rites. When a chieftain died, his people did not merely mourn, they mobilized. The construction of a kurgan was a massive undertaking, requiring the labor of hundreds, perhaps thousands of people to dig a vast burial chamber, line it with timber, and then raise a mountain of earth and stone over it. This act alone was a testament to the leader's command over his community. But it was what they placed inside that reveals the depths of their beliefs about the journey after death. Let us descend into one of the most famous of these frozen tombs at a site called Pazyryk in the Altai Mountains. Here, in a series of kurgans excavated in the mid-20th century, the peculiar conditions of the permafrost created a natural cryopreservation, giving us an unprecedentedly clear window into the Scythian world. Inside Kurgan 5, the tomb of a powerful chief, archaeologists found a scene of staggering opulence and brutal finality. The chief himself lay in a massive log sarcophagus, his body embalmed with a skill that rivaled the Egyptians. Near him lay his consort, a woman who had been killed, as was customary, to join him. But they were not the only occupants. The burial chamber was a stage set for the afterlife. It contained the world's oldest known pile carpet, a masterpiece of Persian weaving. There were tables laden with food, clay vessels, and intricate felt wall hangings depicting colorful scenes of riders and mythical creatures. A disassembled four-wheeled chariot, a symbol of high status, was placed nearby, ready for reassembly in the next world. Every detail was a provision for a life that was expected to continue with all its earthly trappings. But the most striking feature of the Pazyryk burials is the sacrifice of horses. The horse was the engine of Scythian life. It was their transportation, their weapon of war, and a symbol of their wealth and freedom. To part with even one was a significant loss. In the tombs of Pazyryk, they found not one or two, but entire herds sacrificed for a single funeral. Outside the main burial chamber of Kurgan 5, archaeologists uncovered the remains of 9 horses, all richly adorned. They were arranged in rows, complete with their elaborate saddles, bridles, and headgear, decorated with carved wooden griffins and rams' heads covered in gold foil. These were not just any horses. They were the chief's personal mounts, his finest stock, chosen to serve him in the fields of eternity. They were killed with a swift poleaxe blow to the forehead, a method both efficient and, in its own way, respectful. The sacrifice of these magnificent animals demonstrates a crucial point. In the Scythian mind, the line between valuable property and essential companionship was blurred. Horses, servants, and wives were all part of the same retinue, the necessary entourage for a man of power. The death of the consort lying inside the tomb was, in this context, seen as no different from the death of the prized stallion lying outside. Both were essential components of the chieftain's identity, and both were dispatched to ensure that identity remained whole. By analyzing these burials, we can begin to piece together the Scythian understanding of the cosmos. Their world was not neatly divided into the living and the dead. Instead, the grave was a portal, a gateway through which a person's entire household could be transferred. The kurgan was not a memorial, it was a forwarding address. The loyalty demanded by a chieftain in life was expected to be absolute, extending even beyond the final breath. For the woman in the tomb, and for the groomsmen who likely accompanied the horses, this final act was the culmination of a life of service. It's almost certain they understood this to be their fate from the moment they entered the chieftain's service. This was not a sudden, unexpected tragedy. It was the fulfillment of a contract, an oath sealed in blood. The archaeological evidence suggests that these sacrifices were highly ritualized. The victims were often dressed in fine clothing, indicating their honored role in the proceedings. There is little sign of struggle. Many were likely drugged with hashish, the residue of which has been found in bronze censers within the tombs, to ensure a peaceful and compliant passage. This was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to affirm social order, display immense wealth and power, and equip a leader for his final, greatest journey. The silence of the Pazyryk tombs speaks volumes, telling a story not just of death, but of a belief system so powerful that it could command its followers to willingly, or at least quietly, step across the threshold into eternity in the service of another. Leaving the windswept steppes of Scythia, our journey takes us east, into the heartland of ancient China, where the practice of accompanying the dead reached a scale that is difficult to comprehend. Here, under the fertile plains of the Yellow River Valley, the rulers of the Shang and Zhou dynasties, flourishing from roughly 1600 to 256 BCE, built their own elaborate gateways to the afterlife. While the Scythians buried their chieftains with a select retinue, the early Chinese emperors and nobility conceived of their eternal courts on an industrial scale. The practice known as rengsun, which translates to human sacrifice for the dead, was a cornerstone of their political and religious ideology, a stark demonstration of the absolute, unquestionable power vested in the sovereign. The evidence for this is not just archaeological, but also textual. Diviners carved questions onto turtle shells and ox scapulae, the famous oracle bones, seeking guidance from the spirit world. Thousands of these bones have been unearthed, and their inscriptions provide a chillingly bureaucratic record of the practice. They ask questions like, will 10 men be auspicious to offer to Ancestor Ding? Or, should we sacrifice the Chang people to the river god? These were not impassioned acts of grief, but calculated transactions with the spirit world, meticulously planned and recorded. The archaeological record confirms the oracle bones' terse accounts with horrifying clarity. At the royal cemetery of Yingshu, the last capital of the Shang Dynasty, archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of sacrificial pits surrounding the main royal tombs. These are not orderly burials. They are mass graves filled with the remains of men, women, and children. Some pits contain neat rows of headless skeletons, their skulls buried separately in a display of ritualistic precision. Other pits are a chaotic jumble of bodies, suggesting a mass slaughter. One of the most famous tombs, known simply as Tomb 1001, is believed to belong to a Shang king. The tomb itself was a massive, inverted pyramid dug deep into the earth, with long ramps leading down into its central chamber. Along these ramps, and in more than 160 pits surrounding it, lay the remains of his afterlife entourage. This included his personal guards, still holding their bronze halberds, his charioteers buried with their chariots and horses, his servants, artisans, and musicians, and of course his consorts and concubines. In total, the human sacrifices associated with this single tomb numbered well over 300 people. This was not a private funeral. It was a state-sponsored spectacle of power. The sheer logistics of Rengsun are staggering. It required a system capable of procuring, holding, and executing hundreds of individuals for a single event. Many of the victims were likely prisoners of war from neighboring tribes like the Chang, who are mentioned frequently in the oracle bone inscriptions as targets for sacrifice. For them, death was not an honor but the brutal culmination of their defeat. But many others were members of the king's own household. These were the women of the court, the servants who had attended to his every need, and the officials who had administered his kingdom. Their inclusion in his tomb was the ultimate expression of the Chinese concept of a centralized bureaucratic state. The emperor was not just a ruler, he was the son of heaven, a pivotal axis connecting the earthly realm with the celestial. His state, with all its intricate hierarchies and dependencies, was a cosmic necessity. Therefore, when he died, it was essential that the state apparatus, in both human and material form, be transferred with him to the spirit world to ensure his continued ability to mediate on behalf of his living subjects. The sacrifice of his court was, in this sense, a matter of national security. The fate of the women in the emperor's household was particularly stark. While a high-ranking wife might be granted a more dignified death and a burial close to her husband, the hundreds of lower-ranking concubines were often treated with horrifying callousness. Some were killed beforehand and placed in the tomb, but many accounts and archaeological findings suggest they were buried alive. They would have been led into the vast dark pit, perhaps given wine or narcotics to dull their senses, and sealed inside with the emperor's coffin and grave goods. Their role was simply to be a part of the collection, a marker of the emperor's wealth and virility that he could take with him. Their individual lives, loves, and fears were entirely subsumed by their function as imperial property. This practice wasn't confined to the emperors. High-ranking nobles and lords emulated the royal practice on a smaller scale, ensuring their own tombs were provisioned with the necessary human staff. The entire social structure was mirrored in the geography of the tomb. The closer one was buried to the central coffin, the higher their status in life, and presumably in death. The practice of Rengsen thus became a powerful tool for reinforcing the social order. It was a constant, terrifying reminder to every person in the kingdom of their place in the hierarchy, a hierarchy so rigid that not even death offered an escape. For centuries, the fields of ancient China were not just places of agriculture, but vast, silent cities of the dead, built on the bones of those whose lives were deemed expendable in the service of eternal power. At the heart of every kurgan and every imperial tomb lies a profound philosophical assumption, a vision of the cosmos so concrete and literal that it demanded these terrifying acts of sacrifice. This is the belief in the afterlife as a direct and unflinching mirror of earthly existence. In this worldview, the realm of the dead is not a place of ethereal spirits, divine judgment, or karmic rebirth. It is not a heaven of blissful rest, or a hell of eternal punishment based on one's earthly deeds. Instead, it is simply another country, a parallel dimension where life continues with the same rules, the same needs, and the same social structures. Death is not a transformation of the soul, but a migration of the self, complete with all its baggage, social status, personal relationships, and material possessions. This seemingly simple idea has profound and far-reaching consequences. For if the next world is just a continuation of this one, then one must prepare for it with the same practical foresight as one would for a long and difficult journey. Consider the logic from the perspective of an ancient king or chieftain. His entire identity, his very sense of self, was constructed from his relationships with others. He was a king because he had subjects. He was a master because he had servants. He was a husband because he had wives. These were not simply roles he played, they were the constituent parts of his being. To imagine an afterlife where these relationships were severed was to imagine a form of annihilation. To arrive in the spirit world alone would be to arrive as a non-entity, stripped of the very power and status that defined him. Therefore, the necessity of bringing his retinue with him was not born of mere cruelty or a desire for comfort. It was born of a deep-seated existential terror, the fear of becoming a nobody. The sacrifices were, in this sense, a desperate act of identity preservation. His court, his army, his concubines, and his horses were his social armor, and he could no more enter the afterlife without them than a knight could enter battle without his shield and sword. This cosmology elevates the wife or consort to a particularly crucial and tragic position. Her role transcends that of a mere servant or possession. In many of these cultures, the union of the ruler and his primary wife was not just a personal or political alliance. It was a sacred bond that mirrored the cosmic order. She was the queen to his king, the moon to his sun. Her presence was essential to the wholeness of his reign. If he were to proceed into the next world without her, his spiritual household would be incomplete. His eternal existence would be lacking its fundamental counterpart, leaving him diminished and vulnerable in the unseen politics of the spirit realm. The spirit of the wife was therefore required to continue her duties, to manage the celestial household, to provide companionship, and to maintain the sacred balance that their union represented. Her sacrifice was not merely an addendum to his funeral, it was integral to the successful continuation of his reign after death. She was, in the most literal sense, the First Lady of his eternal kingdom, and her attendance was not optional. This belief system creates a world where spirits have tangible needs. The dead get hungry, so food offerings are left at their tombs. They get cold, so clothes and furs are buried with them. They need transportation, so chariots and horses are sent along. And they get lonely or require service, so people must accompany them. The entire practice of ancestor worship, so central to cultures like ancient China, is predicated on this idea. The living have a solemn duty to provide for the dead, because the spirits of the ancestors are not distant, passive observers. They are active participants in the world, capable of influencing the fortunes of their living descendants. A well-provisioned and content ancestor who arrives in the spirit world with his status intact will be a powerful advocate for his family, bringing them good harvests, success in battle, and many children. Conversely, a neglected ancestor, one sent into the afterlife alone and impoverished, would become a hungry, angry, and vengeful ghost, a source of misfortune and disease. The funeral, therefore, was not just about honoring the deceased, it was a critical investment in the future prosperity of the entire lineage. In this high-stakes spiritual economy, the lives of a few dozen or even a few hundred retainers were seen as a reasonable price to pay for the continued favor of a powerful ancestral spirit. The tomb was not just a house for the dead, it was an embassy, a vital link between the visible world of the living and the invisible, but ever-present, world of the spirits. As we trace this dark thread through Scythian kurgans and Chinese imperial tombs, it might be tempting to view widow and retainer sacrifice as a peculiar cruelty confined to these specific ancient empires. But to do so would be to miss the unsettling universality of the practice. This was not an isolated phenomenon, a cultural quirk born of the Eurasian steppe or the Yellow River Valley. Instead, it appears as a convergent cultural evolution, an idea that arose independently in disparate and disconnected societies all across the globe. It is a testament to a common, albeit grim, logic that seems to emerge under certain social and religious conditions. From the river valleys of the Americas to the islands of the Pacific, from the deserts of Africa to the jungles of Southeast Asia, cultures with no possible contact with one another looked at their dead leaders and arrived at the same conclusion. They must not go alone. This global pattern forces us to ask a deeper question. What is it about the human experience of power, death, and the afterlife that led so many different peoples down this same path? Let us turn our gaze to the sands of ancient Egypt. In the very earliest period of the pharaonic state, around 3100 BCE, the tombs of the first kings at Abydos reveal a familiar pattern. Surrounding the central burial chamber of rulers like King Aha and King Jer are hundreds of subsidiary graves. These are not the grand pyramids we associate with later dynasties, but subterranean mud brick structures. Within these smaller graves lie the remains of courtiers, servants, artisans, and women of the harem. Even the royal pets, such as lions and dogs, were included. These individuals were not buried with the lavish grave goods of the pharaoh. Their purpose was simply to be present, to form the eternal court. Forensic evidence suggests they were killed all at once, likely through poison or strangulation, as part of the royal funeral. This practice, however, did not last. Within a few centuries, it had died out completely in Egypt, replaced by the use of symbolic substitutes. Small carved figurines known as **** were placed in the tombs instead. These magical statuettes were inscribed with a spell commanding them to answer if the deceased was called upon to perform manual labor in the afterlife. The Egyptians found a more humane and symbolic way to staff the next world. But the initial impulse was identical to that of the Scythians and the Shang. A king's power is defined by his people, and that power must follow him into death. Now let us cross the Atlantic to the Mississippi Valley in North America, to the 18th century world of the Natchez people. The Natchez were a complex, stratified society ruled by a god-king known as the Great Sun. When the Great Sun died, it triggered a vast and highly choreographed ritual of communal sacrifice. According to detailed accounts from French observers, his wives, along with numerous officials, friends, and retainers, were expected to volunteer to accompany him. This was considered the highest honor. The victims, known as the convoy of the dead, spent the days leading up to the funeral in celebration, feasting and dancing, treated as heroes. They were given a narcotic drink made from tobacco to induce a trance-like state before being ritually strangled by their own relatives, who saw this as a final act of love that ensured their kin a place of honor in the next world. The practice was so deeply embedded that when a French commander tried to save an infant destined for sacrifice, the child's own mother was horrified, believing her child was being denied its rightful, privileged place in the chief's eternal entourage. Here again we see the same core logic. The social structure is eternal, and one's duty to the ruler supersedes the individual instinct for survival. The pattern continues as we move across the Pacific. In Fiji, the death of a great chief was traditionally followed by the strangling of his primary wife, and sometimes several of his other wives as well. This was known as **loloku**, an act seen as a solemn duty and a gesture of profound fidelity. It was believed that the chief's spirit would be met by a fearsome god on its journey, and only by showing that his wife had been sent ahead could he pass safely. The wife's role was to be his herald and protector, even in death. Similarly, in the Kingdom of Benin in West Africa, the death of an Oba or king was marked by large-scale human sacrifices. His wives, palace officials, and slaves were dispatched to continue their service in the spirit world, their deaths reaffirming the cosmic power of the monarchy. What connects these disparate examples, Egyptian, Natchez, Fijian, and Benin, is not shared ancestry or cultural exchange. It is a shared set of social and ideological building blocks, a rigidly hierarchical society, a belief in a tangible and mirrored afterlife, and the deification of rulers. When these conditions are met, the sanctity of individual life, especially for those in subordinate positions, becomes secondary to the preservation of the social and cosmic order. The fact that this grim solution was reinvented time and time again suggests it speaks to something fundamental about how we have historically constructed power, making it a force so absolute that it sought to conquer not only the living world but death itself. Beneath the complex layers of cosmology and ritual, widow sacrifice exposes a stark and uncomfortable truth about the societies that practiced it. It is the ultimate, horrifying expression of a patriarchal system where women were not seen as autonomous individuals, but as a form of property. When we strip away the language of honor, duty, and eternal companionship, we are left with a brutal transaction. The woman's life was a possession, legally and socially bound to her husband. Her existence derived its meaning and value entirely from her relationship to him. When he died, her purpose, as defined by her society, was extinguished. Just as his favorite horse was slaughtered to serve him in the next world, and his favorite cup was placed in his tomb for him to drink from, his wife was sent along to continue her function. This is a difficult concept for us to process through a modern lens, which champions individual rights and self-determination. But in these deeply traditional, patriarchal societies, the idea of a woman having an independent identity, separate from her husband or father, was simply inconceivable. Her life was a story written in relation to a man. When his story ended, hers was expected to end as well. Let's explore the social and economic mechanics that reinforce this view. In many of these cultures, a woman had no independent status. She passed from the control of her father to the control of her husband. She could not own property, conduct business, or participate in public life as an individual. Her entire social standing, her access to resources, and her personal safety were dependent on her husband. When he died, she became a problem. What was to be done with her? She was a mouth to feed, now unattached to a male provider. She was a potential source of social instability. Her remarriage, for instance, could create immense complications. If the widow of a powerful king or chieftain were to marry another man, it could be seen as a transfer of the deceased's power, property, and prestige. It could legitimize a rival's claim to leadership or create messy disputes over inheritance for the children. By killing the widow, the society performed a kind of brutal but effective social accounting. It neatly tied up all the loose ends. It ensured that the deceased man's lineage remained pure and his property undisputed. The widow's death was, in this cold calculus, the cleanest solution. It preserved the patriarchal line of succession and prevented the fragmentation of a powerful man's estate. Furthermore, the practice served as a powerful mechanism of social control over all women, not just the ones who were ultimately sacrificed. The knowledge that a wife's life was tethered to her husband's created a powerful incentive for her to protect his well-being. Some historical commentators, both ancient and more recent, have argued that one of the functions of practices like Sati in India was to discourage wives from poisoning their husbands, a real or perceived threat in a world of arranged marriages and limited female agency. While this is likely a cynical and misogynistic justification, it reveals the underlying logic of control. By binding a woman's fate so inextricably to her husband's, the system ensured her total investment in his survival. Her loyalty was guaranteed not just by affection or duty, but by the instinct for self-preservation. It made her his ultimate guardian, because his death would automatically trigger her own. This created a macabre form of life insurance, where the beneficiary was the man himself. This view of women as property is not merely an interpretation. It is often explicit in the cultural artifacts and legal structures of these societies. In the Scythian burials, the woman is arranged alongside the chieftain's other possessions, his golden treasures, his weapons, his horses. She is part of the inventory of his wealth. In Shang China, the oracle bones list the sacrifice of concubines, with the same dispassionate, quantitative language used to record the sacrifice of livestock. They are assets to be expended. The very concept of a bride price or dowry, common in many of these cultures, originates in a transaction where a woman is, in effect, transferred from one family's ownership to another. Her productive and reproductive capacities become the property of her husband's lineage. Widow sacrifice is simply the logical endpoint of this system. If a person is truly considered property, then the owner has the right to decide what happens to that property upon his death. He can choose to have it passed on, or he can choose to have it destroyed and buried with him. In this light, the ritual loses its mystical aura and becomes a stark and final assertion of ownership, a brand of possession so absolute that it reaches from beyond the grave to claim not just a woman's loyalty, but her very last breath. One of the most haunting questions that arises from the ashes of these rituals is that of consent. As we look at the silent woman in the tomb, we are forced to wonder, did she go willingly? Was her death an act of supreme devotion, a voluntary choice to join the man she loved in eternity? Or was she a terrified victim, dragged to her end by the unyielding force of tradition and coercion? The truth, as is so often the case in human history, is likely a complex and murky blend of both. To speak of choice in this context is to apply a modern concept to a world that had a vastly different understanding of the individual. For many of these women, the idea of refusing their fate might have been as unthinkable as refusing to breathe. Their entire existence, from the moment of birth, was a process of indoctrination into a belief system where this final act was presented as their ultimate purpose and greatest honor. Imagine the immense social pressure. A woman who agreed to accompany her husband was celebrated. She was elevated for a brief period to the status of a living saint, a hero whose sacrifice would bring immense prestige to her family. Her name would be remembered with reverence. Her children would be honored as the offspring of a goddess. She was promised a glorious afterlife, not as a mere servant, but as a queen at her husband's side, her status secured for eternity. Accounts from the Natchez people describe how the women chosen for sacrifice were feted and paraded through the community, treated as celebrities on their way to a grand destiny. For a woman with little to no social standing of her own, this promise of deification, of becoming a central figure in the most important ritual of her time, could have been a powerful, intoxicating lure. It offered a moment of supreme agency in a life that had otherwise been devoid of it. The agency to choose honor over a life of perceived meaninglessness. Conversely, consider the fate of a woman who refused. The shame would be unbearable, not just for her, but for her entire family. She would be seen as a coward, a disloyal wife who had failed in her most sacred duty. Her family would be ostracized, their honor forever stained. Her own future would be bleak. As a widow in a society with no place for unattached women, she would likely face a life of poverty, dependence, and contempt. She would be a ghost haunting the edges of a community that had already marked her for death. In some cultures, the consequences were even more direct. Refusal could lead to violent retribution from the community or the deceased's family. Faced with a choice between a celebrated, honorable death and a long, miserable life of shame and destitution, it is not difficult to see why many might have chosen the former. The choice was not between life and death. It was between a good death and a bad life, and in many of these belief systems, a good death was considered far more valuable. However, the archaeological and historical records are filled with evidence that this choice was often an illusion, a carefully constructed piece of ritual theater. The very fact that victims were so frequently drugged or intoxicated suggests a deep-seated anxiety on the part of the executioners that the victim might not comply at the final moment. The use of narcotics, like the hashish found in Scythian tombs or the tobacco-infused drink of the Natchez, was a practical measure to ensure a smooth, peaceful, and visually acceptable ceremony. A struggling, screaming victim would shatter the sacred solemnity of the event and betray the narrative of willing sacrifice. Intoxication ensured that the woman would appear serene and accepting, whether she felt that way or not. It transformed a potential scene of brutal violence into a tableau of peaceful transition, making the act more palatable for the community that had to witness and participate in it. Furthermore, forensic analysis of the skeletons often tells a story that contradicts the official narrative of willing sacrifice. In many sacrificial burial pits in China, the positions of the skeletons are contorted, suggesting they were thrown into the grave or may have moved after burial, indicating they were buried alive and conscious. Skeletons of sacrificed retainers sometimes show evidence of perifractures on their forearms, a defensive injury sustained when raising one's arms to ward off a blow. These silent wounds are the most powerful testimony we have against the myth of universal consent. They speak of a terror that has no voice in the historical record. They remind us that for every woman who may have walked to her death with a sense of divine purpose, there were likely many others who fought, who resisted, who had to be subdued by force. The illusion of choice was a crucial part of the ritual's power, but beneath that veneer lay the cold, hard reality of a system that would enforce its will, by persuasion if possible, and by violence if necessary. The act of widow sacrifice was never a simple private killing. It was a macabre performance, a piece of public theater meticulously choreographed and staged for the entire community. The period between the husband's death and the wife's final entombment was a liminal time, a space outside of ordinary life, filled with prescribed rituals, elaborate preparations, and a rising sense of collective purpose. This process transformed a brutal act into a sacred ceremony, investing it with a meaning that transcended the individual tragedy. It allowed the community to participate, not as passive observers of a murder, but as active agents in a vital cosmic event. By understanding the procedural steps of the ritual, we can see how it reinforced the social order and made the unthinkable seem not only necessary, but righteous. The process often began the moment the chieftain or king drew his last breath. While his body was being prepared for its long journey, embalmed, dressed in finery, and laid in state, The focus of the court would shift to his designated companions for the afterlife. The primary wife, concubines, and key retainers who were chosen to accompany him would enter a new, temporary phase of their existence. They were no longer of the living world in the same way. As we saw with the Natchez, they were often celebrated, feasted, and honored. This was a crucial psychological step. By treating the victims as heroes or semi-divine beings, the community elevated them above the status of ordinary mortals. They were making a willing gift of themselves to the gods and the ancestors. This period could last for days or even weeks, filled with chanting, dancing, and the telling of epic stories that reinforced the cultural beliefs about the afterlife and the importance of their sacrifice. It was a time of intense social and emotional conditioning, designed to prepare the victims for their fate and to solidify the community's resolve. The next stage was the ceremonial preparation of the victim. Just as the deceased master was dressed in his finest clothes, so too were his companions. The Scythian woman was adorned with a magnificent headdress and silk tunic. Sacrificial victims in China were often buried with their own sets of bronze vessels and jade ornaments. This was not done out of simple respect. It was a practical matter. They needed to arrive in the afterlife properly attired for their station. The act of dressing the victim in ceremonial garments was also a key part of the ritual transformation. It visually marked them as separate from the living, as beings who were already crossing the threshold into the spirit world. This part of the ceremony often involved intricate purification rites, anointing with oils, and the consumption of special foods or intoxicating beverages. Every action was symbolic, steeped in generations of tradition, and performed with a solemnity that underscored the gravity of the occasion. It was a slow, deliberate process of turning a living person into a sacred offering. The climax of the performance was the public procession. The body of the deceased leader, along with his chosen retinue, both the living and those already killed, would be carried from the palace or settlement to the tomb site. This was the moment the entire community became involved. They would line the route, wailing, chanting, and paying their respects. This procession was a powerful display of the deceased's power and the community's grief and solidarity. For the living victims walking in this parade, it must have been a surreal and terrifying experience. They were the central figures in a drama of which they were also the final casualties. The procession served to remove any lingering doubt or resistance. Surrounded by the collective emotional fervor of their people, escape or protest would have been nearly impossible. They were swept along by a tide of ritual necessity, their individual wills dissolving into the overwhelming will of the community. Finally, at the graveside, came the final act. The method, as we have seen, varied greatly. It could be a swift blow to the head, a quiet strangulation with a silk cord, the drinking of a poisoned cup, or the horror of being sealed alive in the darkness of the tomb. Whatever the method, it was performed with ritual precision by designated individuals, often priests or even the victim's own relatives, who saw it as a final, honorable duty. The community bore witness. Their presence was essential. It was their collective gaze that validated the act, that affirmed its legitimacy and necessity. By watching, they all became participants, complicit in the death but also responsible for upholding the tradition. Once the sacrifices were complete and the bodies arranged in their proper places around the master, the tomb was sealed. The finality of this act was absolute. It was the closing of a door between worlds, the conclusion of a great and terrible performance that had reaffirmed the power of the dead, the structure of the society, and the unyielding grip of belief on the lives of individuals. Even in the societies where widow and retainer sacrifice was most deeply entrenched, the practice was not always met with silent, universal acceptance. The historical record is faint, and the voices of dissenters are often drowned out by the grand pronouncements of kings and priests. But if we listen closely, we can hear the whispers of opposition, the emergence of an ethical discomfort that would eventually lead to the decline of these brutal rites. These were the early stirrings of a new kind of humanism, a philosophical shift that began to question whether the needs of the dead, however important, could truly justify the deliberate taking of a human life. This opposition did not arise from a sudden modern-style revolution in human rights, but from a slow, evolving debate within these cultures themselves about the nature of ritual, piety, and the true meaning of honor. In China, the epicenter of mass-scale retainer sacrifice, some of the most powerful critiques came from the very philosophers whose teachings would come to define Chinese civilization. Confucius, who lived in the 6th century BCE during the latter part of the Zhou dynasty, is said to have had a deep aversion to Rengson. While he revered ancestor worship and the proper performance of rituals, he saw human sacrifice as a barbaric relic of a bygone era. He believed it betrayed the core Confucian virtue of Ren, or humaneness. According to later texts, Confucius was so repulsed by the practice that he even condemned the use of lifelike wooden effigies in burials, believing that they too closely resembled real people and could lead to a desensitization towards the value of human life. His famous and perhaps apocryphal quote on the matter is chilling. "He who made the burial figures, did he not die without posterity?" He saw it as a slippery slope, a step on the path back to the horrors of sacrificing the living. The followers of Confucius, particularly the philosopher Mencius in the 4th century BCE, carried this argument forward. They championed the idea that true piety and respect for the dead could be shown through symbolic means. Why kill a living servant when a clay or wooden figurine could magically serve the same purpose in the afterlife? This was a revolutionary idea. It proposed that the intention and symbolism of a ritual were more important than its literal physical execution. This philosophical shift provided a crucial ethical framework for rulers who were already beginning to see the practice as wasteful and destabilizing. A powerful lord might lose his most skilled artisans, his best generals, and his wisest administrators in a single royal funeral, crippling the state for the next generation. The Confucian argument offered a way out. A ruler could appear even more virtuous and wise by sparing his subjects and embracing a more humane symbolic form of ritual. This wasn't just about compassion. It was also about good governance and the preservation of state resources. We also see evidence of legal and political opposition. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, is famous for the thousands of terracotta warriors buried with him in the 3rd century BCE. While this is a staggering display of funerary art, It is also a monument to the end of mass human sacrifice at the highest level. The emperor, a ruthless and pragmatic ruler, understood that his empire needed living soldiers, not dead ones. He replaced the bodies of his army with an army of clay, a symbolic retinue that was arguably even more impressive and powerful as a statement of his eternal command. His tomb represents the culmination of the trend away from literal sacrifice. Following his reign, imperial edicts were periodically issued to further restrict or ban the practice, although it continued sporadically among provincial nobility for centuries. These edicts show that the central state was actively trying to stamp out a tradition it now viewed as both barbaric and a threat to its monopoly on power. A noble who sacrificed his own retinue was, in a sense, creating his own private army in the afterlife, a challenge to the singular authority of the emperor. Outside of China, signs of descent are harder to find but are still present. In ancient Egypt, the practice of retainer sacrifice was abandoned very early in its history, suggesting a rapid cultural or religious shift. The reasons are not explicitly recorded, but the swift and complete replacement with *ushabti* figurines points to a conscious and deliberate rejection of the older tradition. Perhaps it was seen as an offense to the gods, or maybe the evolving theology of the afterlife, with its emphasis on the judgment of the soul by Osiris, rendered the concept of a forced retinue obsolete. Whatever the reason, the Egyptian example shows that even in a society obsessed with the afterlife, a more symbolic and less violent path could be found. These whispers of dissent, whether from pragmatic rulers, compassionate philosophers, or the silent evidence of evolving burial practices, remind us that no tradition, no matter how sacred or deeply ingrained, is immune to questioning and change. They represent the slow, arduous, but ultimately vital process of a society re-examining its most deeply held beliefs and choosing a more humane path forward. The decline of widow and retainer sacrifice was not a sudden event, but a slow, creeping dawn that broke over centuries. It was not the result of a single edict or a single new idea, but the cumulative effect of profound shifts in the very foundations of society, in religion, in philosophy, and in the nature of political power. Like a great ancient tree, the tradition had roots that ran deep into the cultural soil, nourished by beliefs about power and the afterlife. For it to finally wither, the entire ecosystem around it had to change. Understanding this slow decline is to understand the immense inertia of tradition and the powerful forces required to alter a society's relationship with its most sacred rituals. One of the most significant agents of change was the rise of new, transformative religions and ethical philosophies. In India, the emergence of Buddhism in the 6th century BCE introduced a radical new way of thinking about life, death, and the cosmos. The Buddha's teachings on karma, rebirth, and the universal principle of *ahimsa*, or nonviolence, stood in stark opposition to the bloody rites of Vedic animal and occasionally human sacrifice. Buddhism taught that one's fate after death was determined not by the number of retainers in one's tomb, but by the moral quality of one's actions in life. The path to a favorable rebirth was through compassion, mindfulness, and the extinguishing of selfish desire. In this framework, the ritual killing of a widow or servant was not just a cruel act, but a profoundly negative one, generating terrible karma for everyone involved: the victim, the executioner, and the deceased man on whose behalf it was performed. As Buddhism spread across Asia, carried along the Silk Road, its compassionate worldview provided a powerful ideological challenge to the old ways, influencing rulers and common people alike to seek merit through acts of kindness rather than acts of ritual violence. In China, as we have seen, the humanistic philosophies of Confucianism and later Taoism played a similar role. They shifted the focus from the literal, material needs of the dead to the symbolic and moral duties of the living. A truly filial son or a loyal subject honored their deceased lord not by killing people in his name, but by living a virtuous life, maintaining the family line, and performing the proper, albeit symbolic, ancestral rites. This transition from literal to symbolic representation is a key milestone in cultural evolution. The creation of China's terracotta army is the most spectacular example of this. Emperor Qin Shi Huang did not need to slaughter his actual army. His power was so absolute and his resources so vast that he could command the creation of a perfect, eternal replica. These clay soldiers were, in a way, a more potent symbol of his power than a pit full of skeletons. They demonstrated his ability to command the earth itself, to create an army from dust, a feat far more impressive than simply killing what he already owned. The symbolic effigy became a humane, practical, and ultimately more awe-inspiring substitute for the real thing. Another crucial factor was the changing nature of the state. The early societies that practiced retainer sacrifice were often decentralized, held together by charismatic chieftains and kings whose power was personal and absolute. The state asterisk was asterisk the king. As these societies evolved into more complex, bureaucratic empires, the nature of power shifted. Power became less personal and more institutional. A new emperor or king inherited a pre-existing state apparatus, a civil service, a professional army, a system of laws. The state could now continue to function seamlessly even after the ruler's death. In this new reality, sacrificing the court and the army became not just wasteful, but dangerously counterproductive. The state needed experienced officials and trained soldiers to ensure a smooth transition of power and to defend its borders. Centralized law codes began to be enforced over local customs, and these new laws, designed to protect the stability and resources of the state, increasingly forbade private individuals, even high-ranking nobles, from engaging in practices like human sacrifice. The state claimed a monopoly on the power of life and death, and it was not about to let a local lord take his most valuable human resources with him to the grave. Finally, economic and social changes played their part. As societies grew and trade networks expanded, human beings became more valuable as living assets than as dead companions. A skilled artisan, a productive farmer, or a woman capable of bearing children was a vital part of the economic engine of the state. To simply dispose of them at a funeral was an economic folly that growing states could no longer afford. Over centuries, these intertwined forces, the compassionate logic of new religions, the rise of symbolic ritual, the centralizing power of the bureaucratic state, and the simple pragmatism of economics, work together to erode the foundations of widow and retainer sacrifice. The practice didn't vanish overnight, and it clung on in isolated regions for centuries, a ghostly echo of an older world. But the tide of history had turned, moving slowly but inexorably toward a world where a human life, at least in principle, was valued for its own sake, not merely as an accessory to be buried with its owner. For centuries, the victims of these sacrifices were silent, their stories told only through the biased and often incomplete accounts of ancient historians or the stoic grandeur of their tombs. But in the modern era, a new class of witness has emerged, one that can speak with a stark and chilling objectivity: the bones themselves. Through the meticulous work of forensic anthropology and archaeology, we can now listen to what the skeletons remember. Science allows us to bypass the layers of ritual and cultural justification and ask direct questions of the remains. How did this person die? Were they healthy or ill? Did they go peacefully, or did they resist? The answers, etched into the very fabric of their bones, provide a powerful and often harrowing counter-narrative to the idea of a noble, willing sacrifice. They bring us closer than ever before to the final, terrifying moments of these individuals' lives. When a forensic anthropologist examines a skeleton from a sacrificial context, one of the first questions is the cause of death. Soft tissue rarely survives the centuries, so the evidence must be found in the hard tissue of the skeleton. A sharp, incisive cut mark on a cervical vertebra, for instance, can be a clear indicator of decapitation. A circular or depressed fracture on the skull, with radiating lines of trauma, points to a fatal blow from a blunt object, like a club or a mace, a method we know was used by the Scythians. Sometimes, the evidence is more subtle. The hyoid bone, a small U-shaped bone in the neck that supports the tongue, is a key indicator of strangulation. It is a fragile bone, and if it is found to be fractured in an adult skeleton, it strongly suggests that immense pressure was applied to the neck. Finding a broken hyoid in the skeleton of a concubine buried in a royal tomb can transform our understanding of the event from a peaceful, ritualized death into a violent, personal struggle. These skeletal injuries are the final, irrefutable facts of a life cut short. The positioning of the bodies, a field of study known as taphonomy, can also reveal a great deal about the circumstances of their burial. In a normal, respectful burial, the body is typically laid out in an orderly fashion, perhaps on its back or side, in a culturally prescribed position. But in the mass sacrificial pits of Shang, China, the skeletons are often found in chaotic, contorted positions. Bodies are piled on top of one another, limbs akimbo, suggesting they were killed and thrown into the pit with little ceremony. This contradicts the idea that they were all honored companions. It paints a picture of a brutal, impersonal slaughter, more akin to disposing of refuse than interring a respected retinue. In other cases, the position of the skeleton can suggest a live burial. A body found in a pugilistic pose, with arms and legs drawn up, might indicate death by fire or asphyxiation, as the muscles and tendons contract in response to heat or lack of oxygen. The silent posture of the skeleton can scream a story of unimaginable terror. Modern science can also analyze the chemical composition of the bones and teeth to reconstruct a person's life history. Isotope analysis, for example, can reveal where a person grew up and what their diet was like. By examining the isotopes of elements like strontium and oxygen in tooth enamel, which forms in childhood, scientists can determine if a sacrificial victim was local to the area or a foreigner. In many cases, analysis of large sacrificial sites has shown that a significant number of the victims were not from the local population. This lends strong support to the theory that many were prisoners of war or slaves, captured from rival tribes and kept specifically for the purpose of ritual sacrifice. Their deaths were not an act of devotion within the community, but an act of political dominance over outsiders. It was a way for a king to demonstrate his power not only over his own people, but over his enemies, a power that he could exert even in death. Furthermore, advances in paleopathology, the study of ancient diseases and injuries, can tell us about the health of the victims. Were the healthiest and strongest individuals chosen for sacrifice, or were they the most vulnerable? The answer varies. In some cases, the victims appear to have been healthy young adults, their lives cut short in their prime. In others, the skeletons show signs of malnutrition or disease, suggesting that it was the more marginal, less valuable members of society who were chosen for this fate. Each skeleton is a unique data set, a biography written in calcium and collagen. When we combine the evidence from dozens or even hundreds of these individuals, a clearer picture emerges. It is a picture that often stands in stark contrast to the official story of honor and glory. The bones remember the violence, the fear, and the profound inequality of their world. They are the last and most honest witnesses to the reality of a practice that valued the eternal comfort of one person over the very existence of many others. No discussion of widow sacrifice is complete without acknowledging its most widely known and perhaps most fiercely debated iteration, the practice of Sati in India. While the live burials of Scythian consorts and Chinese concubines are largely confined to the realm of archaeology and ancient history, Sati persisted well into the modern era, creating a complex and painful legacy that continues to resonate today. To compare Sati with the other forms of widow sacrifice we have explored is to see both the common ideological roots and the distinct cultural expressions of this phenomenon. Sati, derived from the Sanskrit word for good woman or chaste wife, was the ritual in which a recently widowed woman would immolate herself on her deceased husband's funeral pyre. It was not a hidden act, but a public spectacle, often witnessed by large crowds and celebrated as the ultimate proof of a wife's devotion and purity. The ideological underpinnings of Sati are strikingly similar to those we have seen elsewhere. It was rooted in a deeply patriarchal social structure where a woman's identity was completely subsumed by her husband's. A wife was considered an asterisk ardhangini asterisk, or one half of her husband. Upon his death, she was rendered incomplete, a liminal and often inauspicious figure. A widow's life in traditional Hindu society was typically one of severe austerity and social marginalization. She was expected to shave her head, wear simple white clothing, eat a plain diet, and live a life of prayer and seclusion, seen as a source of bad luck. In this context, the act of Sati was presented as an honorable alternative to a long, bleak life of social death. By mounting the pyre, the woman was believed to instantly purify herself and her husband of all their sins, guaranteeing salvation and a blissful afterlife for them both for millions of years. She would not become a ghost. but a venerated goddess, a Sati Mata asterisk, worshipped at a shrine for generations to come. This promise of apotheosis, of transforming from a wretched widow into a powerful deity, was an incredibly powerful motivator. However, it is crucial to understand that Sati, unlike the mass retainer sacrifices of Shang China, was never a universal or state-mandated practice in India. It was most common among the higher landowning castes, particularly the warrior castes of Rajasthan, where ideals of honor and self-sacrifice were paramount. It was never practiced by the majority of the Hindu population. Furthermore, its historical prevalence is often exaggerated. For every account of a willing Sati, there are numerous others that reveal the brutal coercion involved. Women were often pressured by their relatives, who stood to gain both honor and the deceased's property by preventing the widow from inheriting it. There are many accounts of women being drugged with opium or bhang, or being physically pushed or held down on the pyre with long bamboo poles as the flames rose. The line between voluntary martyrdom and ritualized murder was, as in all these practices, exceedingly thin. The history of Sati is also intertwined with the history of colonialism. When the British established their rule in India, they were both horrified by the practice and hesitant to interfere with local religious customs. For decades, British officials debated what to do, collecting depositions and statistics, torn between their own civilizing mission and a policy of non-interference. This colonial gaze had a complex effect. It brought Sati to global attention, but it also, in some ways, froze the practice in time, making it a focal point of Indian identity for both its British critics and its native defenders. Finally, in 1829, the Governor-General, Lord William Bentinck, with the strong support of Indian social reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, officially abolished Sati, declaring it a criminal offense. Roy and other reformers argued from within the Hindu tradition, using ancient texts to demonstrate that Sati was not a mandatory religious injunction, but a corrupt and barbaric custom. The abolition of Sati did not end the practice overnight, and isolated instances have been reported even into the 21st century. Its legacy is a complicated one. For some, it remains a symbol of ultimate female devotion and spiritual power. For most, however, it is remembered as a dark chapter, a testament to the oppressive force of patriarchal tradition. By placing Sati in conversation with the retainer sacrifices of the Scythians, Egyptians, and Chinese, we can see the bigger picture. We see that the impulse to have the dead accompanied by their loved ones is a recurring theme in human history. But we also see how that impulse can manifest differently, through burial, through strangulation, through fire. Each method reflects the unique cultural, religious, and social anxieties of the society that practiced it. Sati, with its public flames and promise of purification and deification, offers a particularly dramatic and deeply troubling window into the eternal human struggle between love, honor, property, and the sanctity of an individual life. What happens to a memory when it becomes too heavy to carry? What does a culture do with a history steeped in a practice that its modern descendants would find abhorrent? The legacy of widow and retainer sacrifice is often a legacy of silence. In the national narratives of the cultures whose ancestors practiced these rites, this chapter is frequently hidden, romanticized, or quietly erased. The thousands upon thousands of women and men who were sacrificed are, in a sense, victims of a second death, the death of their memory. Their individual names, their personal stories, their moments of terror or resolve, all have been subsumed by the grand, impersonal story of the kings and chieftains they were forced to accompany. How a modern society chooses to remember or forget this part of its past reveals a great deal about its current values and its relationship with its own history. In many cases, the past is simply paved over. In modern China, the Shang Dynasty is celebrated as the cradle of Chinese civilization, the origin of writing, bronze casting, and statecraft. School children learn about the glorious reigns of the Shang kings, the wisdom of their diviners, and the beauty of their art. But the vast, horrific scale of the Rengsun sacrifices that underpin that glory is rarely part of the popular narrative. It is a topic for archaeologists and specialists, a footnote in the academic journals. The sacrificial pits at Yinshu are a tourist site, but the human reality of the skeletons within them is often sanitized, presented as a curious, primitive custom of a distant age, disconnected from the continuous thread of Chinese culture. There is no national day of mourning for the victims, no monuments bearing their names. They are a shameful secret, a detail that complicates the clean, heroic story of national origins. This erasure is a form of forgetting, a conscious or unconscious decision that this part of the heritage is too dark to be integrated into the modern identity. In other instances, the memory is not erased but transformed. It is romanticized into a myth of eternal love and ultimate loyalty. The story of the devoted wife who cannot bear to live without her husband and chooses to join him in death is a powerful and enduring trope. This narrative reframes the victim as an agent of her own destiny, motivated by an epic love rather than by social coercion. It turns a story of patriarchal violence into a tragic romance. We see this in some of the folklore and art that surrounds the practice of Sati in parts of India, where the asterisk, Sati Mata asterisk, is worshipped as a goddess of fierce devotion, her violent death reimagined as a voluntary act of spiritual transcendence. This romanticization serves a crucial social function. It makes the unbearable palatable. It allows a culture to retain a connection to a past ritual without having to confront its brutal reality. The victim is no longer a victim. She is a heroine, and her story becomes an inspirational tale, stripped of its horror. Then there is the silence that comes from simple ignorance. The Scythians left no written records of their own. Everything we know about them comes from the accounts of outsiders, like the Greek historian Herodotus, and from the cold, hard evidence of archaeology. They have no direct cultural descendants who feel a responsibility to interpret their legacy. As such, the sacrificed woman in the Pazyryk tomb is an object of scientific curiosity, not an ancestor to be mourned or honored. She exists in a kind of historical limbo, a fascinating data point for scholars but a ghost with no one to remember her. Her story is told in museum exhibits and documentaries, but it is a story about them, a long-dead exotic people. There is no emotional or cultural continuity that would compel us to confront the human tragedy of her death. She is, in a sense, safely quarantined in the deep past. This collective amnesia, whether it is achieved through deliberate erasure, romantic myth-making, or the simple passage of millennia, serves a purpose. It protects the living from the ghosts of the dead. It allows for the construction of a more comfortable, more heroic national identity. But it comes at a cost. By forgetting the victims, we fail to fully understand the societies that created them. We fail to recognize the enduring power of the ideologies that deemed them expendable. Ideologies about power, property, and the subjugation of women that have not vanished from the world. The silence surrounding the names of these thousands of forgotten souls is a reminder that history is not just a record of what happened, but a story that is constantly being retold. And in that retelling, the voices of the powerless are the first to be lost. As we draw the curtain on this journey through the world's hidden tombs and forgotten pyres, we are left with the weight of the stories we have unearthed. We began with a single silent woman, frozen in time beside her chieftain, and found her reflection in countless graves across the globe. We have seen how the belief in an afterlife that mirrors this one, combined with the absolute power of rulers and the view of women as property, created a deadly logic that persisted for millennia. Now, with a deeper understanding, we can return to our central question: why did this happen? The answer, we can now see, is less about a romantic notion of eternal companionship and far more about a grim assertion of control, a power so absolute that it refused to recognize even the final boundary of death. The practice of widow and retainer sacrifice was, at its heart, a denial of personhood. It was the institutionalization of the belief that the value of some human lives is not inherent, but is derived entirely from their relationship to another, more powerful individual. The concubine, the servant, the guard, their existence was defined by their function. The widow was defined by her role as a wife. When the central figure to whom they were attached died, their own reason for being, as defined by their society, was erased. The ritual that followed was a violent confirmation of this social fact. It was a statement, written in blood and bone, that these individuals were not the protagonists of their own lives. They were merely supporting characters in someone else's story, a story that continued into the grave and required them to play their part for eternity. This is the fundamental horror of the practice, not just the physical violence, but the philosophical violence of treating a person as a thing. And yet, the slow, uneven abolition of this tradition teaches us something profound about the human capacity for change. It shows us that empathy is not a fixed quantity, but a muscle that can be developed over time. The arguments of philosophers like Confucius, the compassionate doctrines of religions like Buddhism, and the pragmatic reasoning of state builders all contributed to a growing recognition that this was a price too high to pay. The shift from sacrificing people to sacrificing figurines is one of the most hopeful stories in our collective history. It represents a moment when a society learns to sublimate its deepest anxieties into symbolic form, to find a way to honor its dead without destroying its living. It is a testament to the power of a new idea, the radical notion that every individual life has an intrinsic value, and that no person's destiny should be irrevocably tied to another's. This was not a quick or easy lesson, and it is one we are still struggling to fully realize today in many other forms. So what do we do with this difficult knowledge? We cannot change the past. We cannot give names back to the nameless skeletons in their mass graves, but we can choose to bear witness. We can refuse to let their stories be silenced or romanticized. By looking squarely at these practices, we honor the victims in the only way we can, by acknowledging their reality and by understanding the forces that led to their deaths. This act of remembering is a solemn duty, for it reminds us that our modern values of individual autonomy and human rights are not a given. They are a recent, fragile, and hard-won invention. They were built upon the ashes of these older, more brutal logics, and they require our constant vigilance to be sustained. As we end our time together, let the image of that Scythian woman remain. She lies in her finery, a silent testament to a world of different beliefs. Her fate challenges us to reflect on the nature of loyalty, the meaning of love, and the price of power. It prompts us to ask what invisible contracts bind us in our own lives, and what traditions we uphold without questioning their true cost. The weight of companionship is a beautiful and a terrible thing, and the stories from these ancient graves remind us that the ongoing struggle for human progress is, and has always been, the struggle for the right of every person to be the sole author of their own final chapter.